Hello, welcome to the LaRouchePAC Weekly Report for February the 29th, 2012. I'm John Hofel, and with me in the studio today are Cody Jones and Sky Shields of The Basement and Lyndon LaRouche. Good morning, Lynn.
Good morning. It's important at this point, for various reasons, to specify that what has been going on for several weeks now on this event here, and what will be going on for weeks to come, is not purely a scientific matter in the sense that it's restricted to the work of scientists and those related. This is also a very important social process. We're in a situation in which the population of the United States has virtually no experience or access to modern technology. And we're now coming into a period where it's required that we introduce factors of economy, physical factors of economy, which have not yet been developed, but which are needed at this point, particularly with changes in the characteristics of the solar system and so forth. We're not keeping up with the running down of systems which pre-existed. There's also a grave psychological problem involved here, is the population in general has lost its mental contact with science, has lost its mental contact with the reality of scientific development. And I think that what we've been doing so far, and I know what will continue in this direction for some weeks to come, will actually be a political access, a morale factor, to reunite the human population with science. Whereas now we have a situation of complete depression increasingly in the population. And mankind is not a creature of zero growth. Mankind is distinguished from the beast by the fact we are not a zero-growth animal. But we live and depend upon scientific progress. And therefore, I think what we're doing here at the table is something which is more accessible to people generally than other approaches to this matter. I think we're able to put across some concepts which will not only enliven the spirits of people who are becoming desperate and despairing. For example, there's a case of a woman, part of the space program down in Texas, who was totally demoralized, whereas 2 years ago she was highly energized in the same function. So we're having a demoralization and de-energization of our population, even among scientific people. And therefore it's important that we use this material and this form of presentation, which we're engaging in as from several past weeks and several weeks to come, in order to attempt to engage the population in an understanding of their essential relationship to scientific progress. And thus they can find, again, their real identity as human beings. We're not like animals, which are stuck with a technology of the same type for life forever as a species. We are human beings. And the essence of human beings is the progress of mankind in its role in the universe as no other species existing. And therefore, when we're cut off from scientific progress as being done today by these clowns who are running the government today in general, that it's essential to recognize and for us who are doing this, to recognize that the people we're addressing through this medium are people who should have a reasonable access to the ideas that we're presenting, because these ideas belong to the people. And presently, with the demoralization of science practice in general in the community, people are losing that contact with the distinction of man from the beast. And it's our job here to make our contribution in that direction at the same time as a natural byproduct of what we're doing at this table.
Mm-hmm. So we'll just start by giving people first the bad news, the negative side of what this turn away from science has produced, what kind of condition it's put us in now. Then we'll come back and counterpose that to what we're saying should be done and how we actually organize or tune, in a sense, man's activity to be coherent with what is the natural anti-entropic nature of the universe. But first, it is important for people to get inside the nature of the collapse. How did we find ourselves where we find ourselves today, and what's the characteristic of the crisis we're in? So first, I'll just introduce an old friend of ours here, the triple curve function, something which I believe you put together in, what, the mid-90s? the mid-90s, which gives you an idea. It's a certain kind of thought object, which gives you an idea of this function of a collapse. What's the characteristic that really, what's the projection of the oligarchical principle is really what you've got here. Is you'll see you've got three curves, but all three of them work together. Really, it's a dynamic process, albeit a negative one. But it's something where, as under the conditions of monetarism, you've got a condition where in order to keep pumping up the so-called value of the financial assets, of the monetary assets, which are created with the intention on the part of the oligarchy to do exactly what we see here, which is to use the monetary system as a means of looting and destroying the physical economic system, the physical side of the economy. So you've got this dynamic where in order to keep pumping up the financial and the monetary side of the function required a constant increasing looting of the physical side of our economy, disinvestment in infrastructure, moving from higher states of platform in the United States like manufacturing, moving it overseas to lower potential states, doing everything you can to systematically shut down and loot the physical economy, as doing it under the justification that this is going to grow the monetary side of the economy. And we're now in a monetarist system, and real wealth is money, real wealth is financial assets, etc. But this has real-world consequences, where you actually find that, in effect, under this system, the more money you have, actually the worse off you are. Now, the way we're going to get into this is that we're going to use as a kind of a case study this relationship between one aspect of the biosphere and its relationship to the noosphere. And we're going to look at it from the standpoint of iron ore. So we're going to look at one case of the buildup of iron ore, in a particular, really the main deposit of iron ore that we've accessed here in the United States, the banded iron formations up around the Great Lakes region, and really did provide the source for the building of the backbone of the United States. We're going to look at this, the broad sweep history of this. So we start with a little vignette we have here, a little animated vignette that looks at the creation of these banded iron formations. So we go back some 3.5 billion years into the history of the Earth. And what you see is you've got an Earth which at the times would have presented itself with a very different continental structure. And also, if you were around at that time, you would have noticed that the oceans had a very different color to them, that they would have actually appeared green in nature. And that's because they were fully saturated with soluble iron. Now, at that time, 3.5 billion years ago, within those iron-rich oceans, and this was also a time when you had a very low oxygen environment on Earth, you had within those oceans, you had a certain form of bacteria that began to operate using the process of photosynthesis, which itself was a real revolution in life, which we don't even fully understand the principle of or even where it came from. But it was a certain evolutionary upshift. So these bacteria, drawing from the energy of the sun, were then transforming that through their metabolic activity. One of the byproducts of that activity was oxygen. Now, this is at a time whenever you had very little oxygen in the oceans. That oxygen then started to bind with the soluble iron. In binding, it created iron oxide, which is a non-soluble product, which then started to precipitate out of the oceans down to the ocean beds and started to lay down these initial bands of iron oxide on the ocean floor until it was till all the iron in that region was drawn out. At which point you started to have an oxygen-rich environment there, which was actually deadly to the existing form of bacteria, because it's a very reactive substance, and it would actually start to rip their little bodies apart. They couldn't live in that environment. So they were basically choking on their own waste. Until what emerged, which was a higher form, the cyanobacteria, which both does photosynthesis, but also evolved to be able to deal with an oxygen-rich environment. Right, actually lived off the oxygen, used the oxygen as an energy source. What that did was that it created the conditions where now the rate at which the iron was being drawn out of the oceans as it would sort of replenish started to accelerate, because now you had a form of bacteria that could both exist in an oxygen-rich environment but was actually more energetic, so it's pumping more oxygen into the oceans to the point where it completely depleted the oceans of the soluble iron. It all formed into iron oxide and laid down effectively the last bed, the last layer of iron oxide in the oceans. So you had this buildup of successive layers where in effect you had, with the earlier form of bacteria, they'd pump out the oxygen, it would bound itself to the iron, that would precipitate down. Then you start to have a buildup of oxygen in the oceans that would kill off most of the bacteria in the environment. They would then die down and become part of then sort of the sediment bed on top of the previous iron bed. With them gone, you'd have another buildup of iron in the oceans, either through currents bringing it in or other means, upwellings from the ocean floor. That would bind up with the existing oxygen. That would allow the previous form of bacteria to kind of regenerate, because now it's got an environment it can exist in again. And you just have this cycle of iron oxide formation, sediment, iron oxide layer, sediment, until then the cyanobacteria came along, the higher form of bacteria, which can exist in an oxygen environment, which started pumping it out and then just completely drained the oceans of the iron, laid down this final layer, and that kind of brought the process to an end. So you had a certain, bounded process there. Now, just to sort of complete the idea, as the oxygen became saturated in the oceans, it started to then gas out of the oceans into the atmosphere. That completely transformed the planet. You now had an oxygen-rich atmosphere, which both provided an energy source for life eventually to move on to land to utilize the oxygen, and it also provided this protective layer for life, the ozone layer, which then changed the relationship of life on Earth to the electromagnetic environment by mediating this process through the atmosphere. So we see just in that, there's just one slice of a certain evolutionary buildup, a certain anti-entropic development on Earth. Now what we're going to move to is an animation that now looks at, just looking at that slice of just this relationship now of the buildup of iron deposits and man's activity. So you're looking at a relationship of the activity of the biosphere and the noosphere. So what you see here depicted in this initial growing cone, you can think of this growing cone as the initial buildup of the iron oxide. You have a certain buildup of the iron deposit, which would actually accelerate towards the end as the cyanobacteria comes in. You get a massive acceleration towards the end, but then it's a bound process. It comes to an end. All the iron is then effectively, in terms of these deposits, is drawn out of the oceans. Now that dynamic, that sort of, you might think of as your little sort of slice of bounded curved space-time, in effect kind of stays in a stable state for quite a while, several billion years in fact. You sort of just have this iron sitting there until, for this particular region, this region up around the Great Lakes area, was in the mid-1800s towards the later 1800s, all of a sudden, man, as we have moved into the so-called Iron Age, and we discover this deposit, we start acting on it. We start mining it. We realize that it's actually a very rich source of iron. It's fairly concentrated relative to other sources of iron, and it becomes the source which drives all of the industrial activity of that whole region. To the point where eventually through the lock system, we are moving it down from Minnesota, from Wisconsin, through the Great Lakes into areas like Pittsburgh, where it was then processed into steel, shipped to places like St. Louis and Detroit. And you just had this whole industrial buildup. Now there's a certain, but as we saw, there was in this particular region, this formation there is a certain limit to it, right? It's not this particular deposit is not an infinite deposit. It has a certain boundary to it based off of this activity of life. In a sense, life evolved past this particular phase. Man is here then acting on what we can think of as a previous phase of the biosphere for then our own development, really with a certain, under the right conditions, with a future orientation. As we start to expand the growth of human activity, you start to draw down on that resource. Now, at a certain point, the resource that you're drawing down on becomes more and more physically expensive to access. You're having to go deeper in the ground to get it. The further back you're going, in effect, acting in time, the further back, the deeper you're going, in effect, you're acting on a more distant time in the biosphere's development. It's actually a less concentrated form, so it's more expensive to get the iron out of the iron ore. And so at a certain point, you reach potentially a point in the future where the amount of effort under a fixed mode, that is, if you're just operating under a fixed mode of technology and production, etc., you reach a point where the amount of effort that you're putting into the extraction and processing of the iron ore becomes physically greater than the value of what you're getting out of the use of that iron ore. And you reach what would be a collapse point relative to that fixed mode of action. That's something which you can forecast to a certain extent. You can kind of recognize that you're moving in that direction. Now, here's where the problem comes in. That's a physical reality relative to any fixed state of activity. What will tend to happen is that the reaction on the part of the oligarchy, because they always want to cling to the past, they always want to cling to a fixed idea, they then, based off of a false notion of the nature of the universe, they promote the idea of entropy. They promote ideas of environmentalism. In that context, they then say, well, look, we're going to run down on this resource. We've got a fixed resource. The best way to deal with this is that we need to start to reduce our consumption. We need to stop having so many people. Let's push that collapse point forward. Maybe we can push off that, we can offset that eventual point of collapse by moving it forward. And so their tendency will to say, let's reduce consumption. And all the environmentalists and people who believe in the second law of thermodynamics will say, yes, that makes sense. That's what we've got to do. Now, we run into a problem with that, because as you'll see in this animation, here we have depicted just sort of the general nature of that kind of idea. The bigger pink cone here, that represents our general anti-entropic baseline of the system. As we've discussed before, the universe, the biosphere, is always moving. It's always developing. So you've got a certain baseline where if we, as human beings, want to continue ourselves to thrive and grow, we have to at least meet the requirement of the baseline of growth. And it's not just growth simply in terms of more, it's growth in terms of change. It's always developing. So if you try to fix your activity to one fixed mode of action, all the things that you're depending on for your existence are themselves changing. Like the climate. I mean, there is climate change. There's always been climate change. The fact that there is climate change is not then reason to then say, well, we have to somehow arbitrarily determine what is the ideal climate and figure out how to change our activity to maintain that ideal climate. No, we recognize the system is always changing. How do we organize our activity to at least meet the requirements of that change, if not actually supersede it to organize it to an even higher order of change? But the oligarchical system will say, no, we've got to push, we've got to start to conserve, we've got to reduce our growth. The effect of that is that as you sort of try to push your horizon point forward, you actually reach a point where your activity drops below the baseline of activity of the biosphere as a whole. And you actually reach a point of collapse. You start to collapse. As you're trying to push the inevitable away from you, in fact, what you're doing is you're pushing yourself into a collapse point. Now you counterpose that kind of an idea to what we've discussed before as the actual nature of the biosphere. As you see in just this diagram, this still diagram, the actual nature of the development of life on the planet has always been one of anti-entropic growth, where each system, in effect, which is dominated by a certain type of animal life, a certain type of plant life, a certain climate, etc., you have a certain state of the biosphere, is always superseded by a higher state, a more dynamic state, a more complex state, one which introduces new, in effect, revolutions in the condition of the biology of life. The previous system goes out of existence, collapses. That's where you get these extinctions, but to be superseded by a higher order system. So we know that the actual natural condition of the evolution of the biosphere, as that actually is reflecting the system as a whole, meaning the galactic and universal system, is always one of growth, of expansion, of development. Whenever we act contrary to that, we reach that kind of collapse point. We reach that breakdown point, as we showed there. Now, unfortunately, and this is something, just to make the point, here's another still, which sort of, just by the implication of what's included in the diagram, what Vernadsky has discussed was that the nature of this growth process is that on the one hand you can measure it in terms of a constant increase in the flux of energy through the system, but you also measure it in terms of the constant, what he called the increase in the biogenic migration of atoms. That the flow of material through the system, the rate of flow, is always increasing. Whether it's iron, whether it's calcium, whatever, the rate of flow is always increasing through the system. So that's how we should always be thinking. How do we increase the rate of flow of the materials that we're consuming through the system to push ourselves forward? To not do that is to embrace death, to embrace extinction. Now here's just some quick diagrams just to kind of give you a sense of, well, what have we been doing? What has been the policy of the United States relative to, say, iron? Well, here you see, since 1960, the United States, in terms of our consumption of, this just has different things, primary metals, other things, but we'll just look at the primary metals. Since 1960, we've actually overall collapsed and flatlined in terms of our consumption of metals. If you look at it per capita, it's even more stark. If you look at this purple line here, which is primary metals, since 1960 per capita, you've actually had a net collapse in the per capita consumption of metals like iron ore. So if you sort of look at the trend in the United States, really since, as we've pinpointed, the assassination of Kennedy, that period, you look from 1900 up till about 1960 or so, it was a steady increase in our use of non-renewable metals, or what we consider not iron, etc. Right? A constant increase, that's a growth function. All of a sudden, around the mid-1960s, we have a little dip and we flatline. Right? We embrace this idea of limited resources, environmentalism, conservationism, and we flatline. We no longer are growing. So we stop growing. Now, just to give you another idea of this, while the United States embraced that conception, here is the consumption of materials since the 1970s, basically a flat line. The rest of the world has been on a trajectory of wanting to grow, of increase. This gives you a certain idea, at least a snapshot of why people want to understand, well, why are we now going to war with, wanting to go to war with China, wanting to go to war with Russia? How does this relate to what you guys are discussing in the domain of science? How does this relate to all this discussion of the biosphere? Well, you think about the way the oligarchy works. Here is just it's kind of hard to see this, but this gives you an idea of, the red is, this is the trend line for Russia, of China over that same period, actually this is from 1980 to 2005. If you look at their trend line, over that period we saw in the United States was a flat trend line of consumption, which was actually a per capita reduction of consumption. China, on the other hand, has had a trajectory of hyperbolic growth in the consumption of steel, copper, building materials. Now, the enemy looks at that and says, that's what we have to take out. They say, look, they're growing. We can't have a system where we're collapsing, our system's collapsing, but some other potential counterparty is growing, is developing, is industrializing. We look at China, they're talking about 100 new cities of 1 million people. They're pushing their space program forward. They're going full thrust with moving towards a nuclear economy. So the oligarchy says, that's the enemy, that's the target. We can't allow a growing system to try to exist while we're intentionally trying to collapse our system. And so when you look at these different trend lines, you have a sense of what some of the dynamic that's behind this insane war drive, behind this idea of while we're moving fleets into the Pacific, while we're trying to antagonize Russia and China through the Syrian-Iranian operation. It's part of this oligarchical intention to destroy civilization. Now, the counter to that is what we've been pushing, which is actually, let me see if we have this here. We'll get it. You'll see, what you're going to see eventually is you're going to see an animation that depicts what should be the policy. Where now we start to realize that how do we start to think about what should be our activity today? If we think from the oligarchical standpoint, which is the second law of thermodynamics, which is environmentalism, you're always thinking from the standpoint of the past. How do we preserve the past? How do we preserve our relationship to the past? As opposed to what we're saying is that no, a credit system says what's the future? Where could mankind be? We could be developing the moon. We could be moving towards the colonization of Mars. We could be building things like Nawapa to address the fact that, for example, in 2009, the report card that's put out by the civil engineers of America gave American infrastructure a D. Right? Drinking water got a D-. Energy got a D+. And they said we have a $2.2 trillion deficit that we would have to put in over the next 5 years. That's just to maintain even the existing baseline. That doesn't even include real growth, which we would be pushing for. So how do we get to this future state, which is the idea of man in the stars, the idea of creating real, healthy, basic living conditions for all human beings? Real health care, enough food to eat, shelter, clean water, basic necessities. That's saying, okay, we know where we could be. That now is basic, the future now acts on what was the previous state of, say, the iron deposits to create the present. That the present is never something in and of itself. It's always looking at how the future acts on the past to redefine really the past, to create our current moment. When you do that, you actually get an opposite trend, where instead of trying to reduce your consumption of things like iron ore, you actually accelerate the consumption. And accelerating it under the right policy to say, hey, we're going to consume more iron ore because we're going to be building Nawapa. We're going to be building nuclear power plants all over the place. The lunatic or the person who doesn't know economics might say, well, isn't that going to bring us closer to this collapse point? Isn't that going to bring us closer to the point we run out of resources? When the reality is, in doing that, you in fact redefine a whole new resource base. Once you move towards, say, a full nuclear economy, now you're able to actually transmutate and create new resources through the nuclear process. Once you start being able to leave the bounds of Earth itself, you start realizing, hey, we can mine the asteroid belts. We can mine the moon. We open up a whole new domain of accessible resources, so to speak, because of really this creative function of mankind. Whenever man acts from the future, he actually pushes the creative principle of the mind, which is always redefining any kind of boundary that you might find. And that's really where we have to move things. If the United States, if the world is going to rescue itself from this current extinction phase, because we really are moving towards an extinction, whether through actual just physical collapse biological and physical collapse, but then also the fact that the reaction to that crisis on the part of the oligarchy is to move us towards war, is to move us towards a self-induced extinction through thermonuclear war. The way out of that is to revolutionize our thinking about our relationship to the biosphere and our relationship to time, to now say the future is what must determine our activity today, that the present is always the relationship between a creative, imaginative intention for the future acting on the past, in a sense, to define a generated state of the present. You're always generating the present from the future. And that's how what I think we'll come to realize, that all processes in the universe, from the abiotic to the biotic to noetic, are always operating from the future, is actually what's defining anything that you might identify in the present. And so I just want to throw that picture out there, and maybe we can open it up for some discussion here.
All right. No, I mean, what's funny is it gets to the point that you opened with also, Lynn, on this. I mean, both, at the same time, I mean, you see this, this is the mode of operation that we obviously need to take up for a study of physical economics. But what it means is that you're going to have to revive in the population the sense that this is, you know, to give you an idea of the reality of this thing, if you have a population that has no sense of the future, you've got a population that cannot be mobilized to do anything. And people don't realize how pervasive this is culturally. I mean, we discuss a lot of the evil of the rock, drug, sex counterculture. Other people do also. But often when it's presented in a sort of very simple moralizing mode. That, oh, okay, well, what's wrong with this? Oh, this is something that maybe it's simply biblically wrong, or they've got some set of rules that it violates. But the real crime here is that what's it designed to do? The human instinct recognizes that when you hit a point of zero growth like this, that they're dying. The real human soul left untouched realizes that that's death, realizes that this is something that's not human, this is not natural. And you get waves of this expressed in the population. You get this hatred of other human beings. You get the sort of waves you see in the youth violence. You get this waves of a certain kind of suicidal tendency in one form or another. The introduction of something like a rock, drug, sex counterculture is designed to kill as much of the humanity as possible, however much it takes to keep people from having that response. You say, okay, well, if somebody's been drugged up enough, they're obviously not going to have they're not going to realize what it is that's actually destroying their soul. And people say it. They say, okay, well, why, if you ask somebody in the current youth generation, well, why is it that you feel the need to smoke marijuana? And you look, it's pervasive. And they'll complain, well, how can you take this from me? I need to wind down and forget things sometimes. I just need to get away. The same thing they say for the entertainment. Well, I just need to get away sometimes. I just have to take my mind off where things are. Now, the real question that should occur is, what is going on so very wrong that you feel the need to escape from it? And what's hidden underneath the surface is exactly this. When you hit a state of zero growth, it's not zero growth. You're not sitting still. You're actually dying. Yep. And it's not just a physical death. There is a death of the soul that comes from when you remove the space program. You take away what Kennedy had with the space program. You take away the idea that you have a real potential for a future. You tell people that they're never going to have the chance to develop Africa. You say, well, all you can do, you can send blankets, you can send cans, but really, Africa will never have infrastructure. Africa will never have rail. Africa will never have power systems. Even if somebody doesn't register consciously, if that is accepted anywhere in their mind as a truth about the way the world operates, your soul dies. The moment somebody exceeds to that as the situation of the world in which they live in, your soul begins to die at that moment. And then the desire is to try and see if you can erase that. So the trick now, culturally, the real political question right now, it seems to me, is can you revive that sense, that human quality in the population, and that human sense of a relationship to the future?
We can. The problem involves attacking certain false presumptions. One is the notion of the human individual, as defined as the human individual. That the assumption that the human individual has everything contained within them, their willpower, their perspective, and so forth, which is false. Because actually the human individual's behavior is socially induced as a social process. And that's the number one error. Also, we are an integral part of the universe, physically, in terms of real physics. So that we are predominantly a living process, and as we know in the case of humanity, not only are we a living process, which animals are, for example, but human beings are not animals, except often they choose to behave like them. The human being is actually a creative force. Only human beings have the ability to create new states of existence by will. No other species has ever been able to do that. There's no knowledge of that. But then you have a difference among people. You have people who are conditioned to believe that they are animals. Same old, same old. That's an animal. Who becomes an animal? The victims of the oligarchy. Who becomes an animal? The people who are told they are animals, unlike the ruling gods above them, the oligarchical system. As far as we know, in civilization so far, as far as an actual dialogue of people with people on these questions, what we know is that the problem here is you have two general classes, which are not just social classes in the crude sense, but they're actually a division in the way people evolve, the intellectual functions evolve. Some people believe that it's better not to change. Some people believe in the same old system as their destiny. And other people who are the rulers believe that the same old system is what they have to administer to enable to control the population in general. So what you get is a developmental process in the human mind. And the only thing that has a mind of that type is human beings. We don't know of anything else, any living creature that has that thing. Think of how few people in the total population actually are creative. A very tiny part of the total population is actually functionally creative, willfully functionally creative. You have some people who, in a certain degree, respond to the influence of creativity by others. But you have some people who stick in the mud of non-creativity. And what the dope addict is doing, the marijuana freak is doing, is actually killing their mind in order to suppress their conflict with the reality of progress.
Yeah.
It erupts. They are compelled to progress. They're compelled to develop. They're compelled to invent. And they resent that. They want to have the comfort of the old sock that never was washed. And they find that blessing in marijuana or similar kinds of dope. So the problem is we don't understand in the sense of society's leadership, does not understand currently the meaning of what a human being is. That's where the problem lies. We are actually, mankind demonstrates this in power systems. When we go to the actual use of fission, now fission exists, but the use of fission as a power was a recent development. Now we go to thermonuclear fusion. Efficient and then thermonuclear fusion. Then we go to matter-antimatter reactions. These are, we correlate these things with what? We correlate the things with the ordinary fission structures, with the thermonuclear fusion processes. We are now actually engaging experimentally in the matter-antimatter processes. We're actually engaging in that now. We don't have the mastery of it we'd like to brag about, but we actually have an awareness of this. And this is obviously not the limit of the universe. There are other things which I know of, just from my work, that there are aspects of the nature of the human being's mind in the universe as a whole, which are very little understood. And we know there are reaches beyond this which mankind can attain. And what does this mean? When we can go to a rate of flying to Mars within 1 week from Earth or from the Moon, which is a thermonuclear fusion capability properly used, we're also going to matter-antimatter things. We are now dealing with matter-antimatter processes. And there are processes beyond that which we have yet to really define. So therefore mankind's ability is to create a recognition and utilization of these higher degrees of power of mankind's existence, and to change the universe willfully in a way necessary for human destiny. And therefore, what happens is we become conditioned. So generation after generation have become, since Kennedy was assassinated, become more and more stupid, generation by generation, and stratum by stratum. And therefore you have a dehumanizing process which has taken over. And what we're seeing the management from the beginning of the oligarchical system as we know it, where some people treated other people as animals and denied them the right to express anything. Even the idea of mankind should not have the right to use fire. This issue, that mankind is the only creature which willfully uses fire. No other creature, living creature that we know of, uses fire as a willful choice. Most people are not allowed to use fire in more than the crudest way. And this bounds man. It also conditions mankind so that the majority of populations accept the imperial system, in which a small oligarchy imposes its will by imposing stupidity on the mass of the people. And then periodically, when the people become excessive in numbers, from the standpoint of the oligarchy, they kill them off. So the British monarchy, the British Queen, and her whole apparatus have said they've now declared the human population must be reduced from 7 billion people to less than 1 billion people. And they're on the road to do it. And then you have all these silly people who believe in environmentalism. They're brainwashed. They're zombies. Nobody but a zombie could believe in zero growth, except the oligarchy who believes that they have to use zero growth as a way of controlling the population. So the zero growth is either evil or stupid. And they cannot be trusted with fire of any kind. So that's our problem. We are dealing with, we have to recognize that the idea of mankind is something which is plucked into, like a colonist, into the universe. Mankind is an integral part of the forces of the universe. And we're finding that more and more. Look, when we discover the meaning of fission, as opposed to discovering the effect of fission, when we discover thermonuclear fusion, when we discover the antimatter principle and recognize today that the antimatter principle is the most important factor in the functioning of this whole damn universe, even the solar system. And ordinary people don't recognize that. So we realize that mankind and mankind's creative powers as a mind, with a mind, is something that affects the universe. So we're not an object within the universe, we're an integral, functional part of the universe. And our capabilities are a functional part of the way the universe works. That evidence is to all of us who know these things, recognize this is clear. So therefore we don't recognize, by ignoring these factors, we don't recognize what we're dealing with. Mankind has a potential which is far beyond anything that the great majority of humanity has any inkling of.
Yeah. What's funny is what you're expressing now so rigorously is what every successful religion had tried to do, had made stabs at. You get these approximations in kind of mythological form trying to express exactly this point. But this is a condensed form of it. What's exciting is the situation right now is so bad, but specifically because it's so bad, we've got the opportunity to take this concept and make it conscious, self-conscious, really for the first time in human history. This is the nature of human beings and you can act on it in this fashion.
One of the things we have to do, we have to get now more clearly across to a larger part of the population of the matter-antimatter function. Because it's treated as mystically, but there are aspects of it which are relatively accessible to any intelligent, educated person. For example, the Van Allen belt question, which we dealt with a few weeks ago. This demonstrates how the solar system that we live in is defined by matter-antimatter relations. You don't know how the solar system works unless you don't understand exactly how matter-antimatter functions work. We got this thing in the South Atlantic phenomena, the anomaly. Another case of this. We have knowledge which has been collected by various people who do the work, which indicate these things to us.
Yeah.
that we as mankind, if we develop ourselves as mankind, not as some imitation animal, not as some, freak on marijuana or something like that, that if we do that, we recognize that there are ideas like matter-antimatter reaction can be readily made comprehensible to intelligent persons.
Right.
And can begin to do things based on that knowledge. And we now find that it's absolutely necessary for us to develop the use of that knowledge because we're now running into problems like the fluctuations of the Van Allen belt and the lessons we learn from that, which indicate this is something we have to have a practical access to and use of.
And a larger swath of the population. I mean, it seems like you've got to have it. If this discussion doesn't become much broader, it doesn't become culturally endemic, then we're not going to get the rate of breakthroughs that we need.
It's going to take us 2 to 3 generations to do that, because the problem is in the enculturation of generations as such. For example, take the case of the United States. We came out of the revival of civilization from the Great Dark Age. This thing, Nicholas Akuza and similar things similar people were crucial in this process. And this process went through generations from Kuza's generation, which is the early and middle part of that century, moved into the following century, which gave us Kepler and things like that, moved into a further development, so that mankind, through successive generations, has been able to advance in the quality of the human being's ability to determine our future. And therefore, the problem we have today is we have had a degeneration, typified, particularly since the death of Kennedy. The United States has gone through a process of consistent degeneration, both of the population's behavior and of the minds of the citizens. The citizens today, the generation out on the streets today, as teenagers and young adults, are inferior in their human characteristics to the previous generation. Yeah. And to a large degree, the generation before that was more intelligent than the generation then.
Yeah, they've lost even an intuitive sense of the relationship of the creative mind to the universe as a whole.
Because the emotions cannot be separated from science.
Right, and that's the point, is that there's this idea that somehow that the universe is this objective thing, this objective phenomena, and that we just exist in it, kind of as victims or pinballs bouncing around within this process. What we see, for example, what comes up when we look at the matter-antimatter reactions, is that we see that the characteristic of how matter or how antimatter exists is that it exists through a creative process. It exists through an intersection of a number of different, what you might think of a number of different fields of activity, which create the antimatter as a kind of singularity within this interaction of different processes. Then you realize it starts to become clear to you when you're involved in that kind of a process of investigation, is that the characteristic which bounds the system as a whole actually has the same quality as the subjective nature of the creative mind. And you see that in a sense we live in a subjective universe, in a sense. We're not in this objective object. We're in a universe which is constantly in the process of becoming a creative process.
But more specifically, we recognize that human creativity defines the human mind, which is the only agency we know of that has that kind of creativity, willful creativity.
Right. Right.
And in all honesty, it's the only thing you know.
Exactly.
I mean, sort of, the existentialists play a funny game with it, but it's not so crazy. The one thing that you know is what you know. You know ideas. You always interact with ideas. The myth that you interact with objects or other things that are sort of outside is not really true. You're always interacting with concepts, including your concepts of these objects. Your idea of the objective universe is subjective, not in the way that the counterculture says it's subjective, though, not willy-nilly whatever, but it's something that follows strictly the laws of human creativity at all levels.
We'll take the comparison of the ancient Egyptian pyramids, the Grand Pyramid, And this was which involved, they were not slaves. They could not have done that as slaves. This was they actually had workshops and residences at the base of the Great Pyramid region. And the buildup was done by a technology which was superior to the technology used in generations later, 1,000 years later, and so forth. So what we're dealing with here is exactly that point, is that human creativity is a natural condition of humanity. And when human beings are not being creative, they're not being fully human. And so you have this progress in society of generations, which are progressive generations, and though declining generations. And it's always this conflict between creativity and the oligarchy. The object today is reached the point that mankind cannot live safely on a planet or in this solar system under the rule of an oligarchy. The oligarchical system must be destroyed. Yeah. Because if it's not destroyed, as we see now with the threat of the thermonuclear war hovering over us right now, on any day nearby, it is now possible and even increasingly likely that a thermonuclear war will burst out from which even perhaps no human being will survive. If this is the situation. Therefore, since this condition, which is represented by the British Empire, which is actually an empire, a world empire, we can no longer tolerate the existence of this system, the oligarchical system on this planet. We can no longer tolerate oligarchical imperial systems, because the risk is so great now that the very existence of such systems in their desperate condition today threatens the extinction of the human species. And their mankind, which is fit to be called mankind, is going to eliminate that oligarchical system now, because we've reached the point we can no longer tolerate its presence.
In particular, if we're going to be trusted with more intensive types of power, like matter and antimatter technologies, a humanity that still has an oligarchy attached to it cannot be entrusted with that kind of development.
They have a weapon in thermonuclear fusion now to destroy the human species. And it's likely, because what's going to happen, the British are now going to push for extinction. They're going to threaten it, hoping that they can get total control of the planet. They see China and Russia and some India, of the countries of Asia in particular, as being a source of threat to the oligarchical system, because those nations cannot exist under the conditions of the oligarchical system. So the British and so forth are going to threaten what? That the whole world submit to the oligarchical principle. Otherwise, we're going to blow your heads off with thermonuclear power. And therefore, we have to eliminate thermonuclear power as in the hands of an oligarchy. But you can't do that unless you eliminate the oligarchy. Therefore, the British Empire has to be broken up. Because the British Empire cannot function with its weapon system against the world unless it controls the United States president. And anybody who supports Obama, who is the British agent behind this, is actually committing treason against the human race. However, whatever their excuse is, cheap or otherwise. This system must be eliminated now. We have to go back to a system of sovereign nation states among people who are engaged in joint projects of mutual concern and go on to the conquest of the solar system, which we're prepared to do. We've got to restore man to what mankind really is, not some poor slug who's kissing the rump of some oligarch. And I think there's a possibility. We have, in the United States, we've seen some resistance to the Obama threat, which is really the British threat. Standing up, it's been the block. We could have been in a thermonuclear conflict before the last year, already.
That was the intent.
That was the intent, and it's the courage of some people, including in our system, who resisted that, which postponed that, as opposed to all those politicians who are kissing the butt of Obama right now. And the kissing the butt of Obama is the incendiary device which will set off the destruction of civilization. So what we're really dealing with is the question of what is the nature of mankind in the universe, and how do we protect mankind in what we now know to be the expression of its natural function within the universe. How do we get rid of the oligarchical tradition and develop citizens who are in pride of what they are as human beings, and do the kinds of things we know have to be done?
Yeah. But yeah, exactly. And I think it does emphasize the point you've continued to make, and it's becoming even more clear, is that the revolution, in effect, that has to be effected to bring about this change is a revolution in the way that we think of such, what are taken for granted as fundamental ideas of things like time, of space, of matter. If we can effect a change in the way that people think about those concepts, it then redefines their whole idea of their place in the universe.
And we have a destiny in the universe, a destiny to choose or to lose. And that has to be the fundamental motive of the organization of human society, as opposed to what we have now. Yes, nation states, democracy in a certain sense, yes, absolutely. The right to have sovereign nation states, but also all on the condition of a natural law. What is the condition which is the destiny and purpose of mankind? And under that law, we have freedom within that law. And that is the proper intent. And without that, it's obvious now the threats to humanity by this crazy creep of an Obama. Right? How can a lunatic, an actual insane person, Obama, be allowed to be president of the United States as an agent of the British Empire? How can this happen? It means we've gone too far. With the threat of thermonuclear war now, everything has gone too far. And we have to find people who are decent enough to fight to make sure that the Obama problem does not succeed, that this factor is eliminated in times to prevent the destruction of civilization. And that's reality right now. And our science is actually a sacred responsibility. The development of those ideas and means of ideas by which we advance the condition of humanity is a sacred responsibility of mankind, and particularly of the governments of mankind. Progress must be achieved, and no one has a right to put any blocks on it.
All right, anything else? Okay, that'll do it for this week. We'll see you next week. Thank you.